Shalom, Talmudim. I want you to think back to various times that you have heard sermons or been in conversation or read articles or listened to lectures when the subject was the first creation account in the Bible in Genesis 1. Have you encountered a sermon or a professor or an author or a friend talking about this text who referred to God as saying that creation was good or proclaiming creation good at various points throughout the story, or throughout the poem, rather? This is something that I have encountered dozens, if not hundreds of times in my life, and the more time that I spend with it, the more, the deeper the desire I have to speak out about, really to say that God never said it was good. Not once in the creation account does God say that creation is good. And I think that the distinction between God saying it is good and God seeing that it is good is critical. It's a critical distinction, and I want to just suggest to you why. So, throughout the creation story, God is revealed as a God who speaks and creation comes into existence. That God's word is enfleshed in the world. That God draws God's breath, the ruach, and articulates that breath into the material world. And so God creates through God's speech in the creation story. And so one way of viewing God's speech in creation is as God's work. That when God speaks, God is working, God is creating. That's one thing. So hold that onto the side. Another part of this is that the narrator describes God's beholding creation as good instead of giving those words to God, who then speaks those words. So the first reason to make the distinction is because that's the distinction that the narrator makes. The narrator gives God a bunch of words. God speaks creation into existence, but the narrator describes God beholding or celebrating the goodness of creation. Vayar Elohim kitov, and God saw how good it was, or and God saw that it was good, and God saw indeed it was good. However you want to translate it. So the first reason is that God actually doesn't say that it's good. That's one reason not to say that God said it was good. But the second reason is this distinction between God's work and whatever we want to call this beholding of creation's goodness. I want to suggest to you that when God steps back and looks at the goodness of creation, takes in the goodness of creation, this is an intentional contrast to God's work, and is in that way an anticipation of the Sabbath on other days of creation. For on the seventh day, God rests in creation. And it does not say on the seventh day, Vayar Elohim kitov. And so I'm taking some exegetical license to interpret what that means as God investing God's self in creation. So God blesses and God sanctifies the seventh day, and we understand those words in Hebrew as describing God investing God's self in something else. When God blesses or God sanctifies, it's a pouring out of divine power, of divine presence into something else. In this case, it's the day itself, not an object, but time is sanctified and blessed. And so God pours God's self out. God enters in some fundamental way into the day, and in the day, in the midst of creation, and participates with and celebrates the goodness of creation. Exodus 31 refers back to this time and says that God was refreshed through God's participation, through God's enjoyment of creation. And so this distinction between God speaking the goodness of creation and God beholding the goodness of creation is a distinction between work and rest, work and celebration, or Sabbath. And so there are these many celebrations, many anticipations of the Sabbath on the days leading up to the seventh day that then get realized or actualized in the day itself. Now, there's a beautiful book written by Bill Brown called The 7 Pillars of Creation. And in this book, he has a chapter on 7 different distinct creation traditions in the Old Testament, which he suggests all 7 are necessary to be held together to get a full picture of the biblical teaching on creation, instead of just taking Genesis 1 and only reading that, or perhaps Genesis 1 and 2, and seeing the 2 of them as the Bible's teaching on creation. He says we need to take into account the whole teaching of the Bible. And he lists the 7 passages in the book. But in his chapter on Genesis 1, another part of the book that's really interesting and relevant for the example I want to give you is that he takes the account, let's say Genesis 1, and then he also brings that account into conversation with contemporary scientific explorations or evidence or new discoveries that are relevant for the content of that passage. And he brings them into conversation and then offers some new or nuanced interpretation of what happens when you bring the Bible and science into conversation. And so in his chapter on Genesis 1, he talks about this moment of God seeing the goodness of creation. And in order to get at this, he talks about recent experiments in physics where I don't understand all the details of this. I don't have necessarily a scientific mind, but this is how I understand it. He says that in physics experiments, particularly looking at matter at the subatomic level, so not looking at molecules, but looking at the components of atoms, looking at particles and quarks and these kinds of things. Merely the presence of a human observer to the experiment changes the results of the experiment. So the particles act in different ways when there is an observer of the experiment than when there is not. So the mere fact of being watched impacts the way that these particles operate at the subatomic level. This is fascinating. The observer is not doing anything actively to the particles, is not manipulating them, is not breathing or shaking or doing anything. Simply the fact that someone is watching changes the way that the molecules or the particles or the atoms operate. And Bill Brown takes this insight and applies it to Genesis 1 with some a kind of playful um, uh, wondering. And he says, let's think about this moment where God sees the goodness of creation in all these days leading up to the seventh day, the climactic seventh day. And he says, is it possible that God stepping back and looking at creation is part of what makes creation good? So God speaks creation into existence, and then God steps back, and the fact that God observes with total, complete presence and attentiveness and love and joy and delight and celebration, that the fact that God looks and sees creation is what completes creation's goodness. Is it possible that God seeing creation as good is actually what makes creation good? And how does that impact or implicate the way that we interact with the world? If we look at each other as created fully in the image of God, people who are similar to us or different from us, people who we know well and people who we don't, people who we understand and people who our culture around us or the media would have us be suspect of. If we look at everyone that we know and see in them the full image of God and delight in their presence and give our full attention, what impact might that have on the relationships that we have with those people? Or to apply that to the world around, what if we brought our full presence and our delight and our joy to the created world and saw it as good? What impact would that have on the way that we interact with the world, the way that we use the world as a resource? If we looked at a garbage dump and thought about it, would that impact the way that we use styrofoam in our churches? If we look at the rainforest in Brazil, would that impact the way that we buy beef raised in Brazil on ground that's been on rainforest land that's been deforested to create space for bigger ranches? What impact would it have if we tried to practice this? And what might it mean that God looks at creation and sees its goodness and in that moment completes the goodness of creation? That there's a reciprocity between God's delight and creation's fullness. So I hope that this has been interesting for you to think about, and you can send me thoughts if you'd like. Shalom.